Hi everybody, my name's Amrit and yeah, I'm a graduating student here at Kingston and I'll be hosting today's panel discussion. But I want to say thank you all for joining us this morning for Art Learning, Anti-Racism, the realities of race and difference in art education. Just before I introduce you to our panellists and give you a bit of background of what the event will look like and how it came to be, I just want to say thank you to the Fine Art Department at Kingston and in particular to Joe, Mark, Michelle and Tara and JJ for their support and collaboration in both helping and working with me to organise today's event to hopefully challenge the institution that houses us. So yeah, thank you guys, I really appreciate it. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panellists today. Joining us today we have Adeshola Akinleye, who is an artist, scholar, choreographer, director of Dancing Strong, and a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Arts and Creative Industries at Middlesex University. Also, we have Kalwant Bhopal, who is a professor of education and social justice. She's also the director of the Centre for Research in Race and Education, and is the author of White Privilege, the Myth of a Post-Racial Society. Lastly, joining us is Harold Offey, who some of the Kingston students will know as he's done a lot of talks with us before. And he is an artist and academic working in a range of media, including performance, video, photography, learning and social justice. So briefly, I just want to just talk about how the event came to be. And the concept of the discussion sort of grew out of the APR zine, which we launched here at Kingston back in March. And for those of you who haven't read the zine or haven't had the chance to access it, it's not a requirement in order to take part and listen today. But I know for those that are at Kingston, I think it's posted up on Canvas, part of the professional skills module, I think. So yeah, but anyway, the attempt of the zine is to collate the interpersonal discussions surrounding the subject of race and racism between students and staff, and to sort of branch this out to a much broader discussion for all through forging connections, dialogue and opportunities for learning. The zine is intended to simultaneously provoke and support dialogue through artworks and texts. It's designed to signal to current and future students that we have begun an urgent dialogue and that their experiences of the challenges of higher education need not be alone. A particular reality is a space for sharing rather than telling, and we are committed to providing a non-hierarchical space to support marginalised students and staff and to cultivate creative expression. One of our main aims is that we call for institutions to serve people's differences better, and we strive for those who make up the institution to feel more connected to a network of practitioners, educators, creatives and collaborators. Our speakers today may or may not refer to our zine, but they will be responding to the APR's 3 key imperatives: art, learning and anti-racism, in relation to their own work and the research that they carry out. And on behalf of a particular reality, we hope today's panel discussion is a valuable and a fruitful one. And we hope we can end today with intentional solutions and ways forward to make our education a better one. So the first session of this discussion, we will start with Kalwant. I was wondering if you could just respond to the anti-racism imperative and sort of talk a little bit about the work that you do as the director of the Centre for Research and Race Education and how it sort of relates back to the APR, the wider project.
So the key focus of my work and the Centre for Research in Race and Education is specifically exploring how discourses and narrative of racism, institutional, structural and individual racism continue to persist in educational structures, particularly my work particularly focuses on higher education. And what's interesting about the current discourse and narrative and actually political, social and economic climate that we're living in is that race has taken on a renewed focus. So since the eruption of the Black Lives Matter movement last year, it almost feels as though race is hugely important and we are in a significant moment. However, I beg to differ and question whether in fact this will actually make any difference. And what's particularly interesting around race is that we've had significant advances in policy making. So we've had the widening participation agenda, which was really important to advance the position of marginalised groups in higher education. And we've had the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000, which introduced a definition of institutional racism, which was hugely beneficial and important. And that was a result of the Macpherson report, which was the tragic killing of Stephen Lawrence. And then I'm old enough to remember that as a particular moment. And since then, 21 years since the publication, nothing has changed. In fact, I argue things have actually got worse. We've also had the Equality Act, which has protected characteristics. The Equality Act is important because it includes race as a protected characteristic. Now, we are in a particular moment because we've had members of our government, particularly Kim Badenoch, standing up in the House of Commons telling us we cannot teach critical race theory. We've had a recent report that was published last week, which tells us that white privilege is dangerous and divisive, and it doesn't exist. And we've also had the recent CRED report, the Sewell report, which found no evidence of institutional racism. So I despair that we are living in very dangerous political times. So we have to look at anti-racism work within that framework.
Yeah, I was wondering, when that report did come out, I think fairly recently, saying that the government had done a investigation and they claimed that institutional racism wasn't a thing in education. And for someone that, you know, your work is all around that, what sort of feelings arose from that when that claim came out?
Well, probably cannot say live how I felt, but I did write a piece in The Guardian the next day, the day after the report was published. And for me, I was very angry because, I mean, it kind of reminded me a little bit about when Theresa May did an audit. Theresa May's government did an audit of racial disparities. I don't know if you remember that. Now, everything that was in that report was not new. Those of us who've been working in this area for 30 years, we know the evidence is there. We don't need any new evidence to tell us that structural and institutional racism exists. And when this report was published, I don't think it was unexpected because there were hints of the report, particularly in what Kim Badenoch had already said, and also in what Liz Truss had said, and she also criticised Foucault, and they've openly criticised critical race theory and white privilege. So they kind of paved the way for it. But I see this report and this rhetoric as propaganda. This is something that hasn't just happened this year. This has been going on for many years, pre-Brexit and post-Brexit. And also it's been going on in the US as well, because Trump also denounced the teaching of critical race theory, but before that. But I think this is just a really good example of the ways in which racism has now become acceptable. You know, get over yourself, go back to your own country and so on. I mean, after Brexit, there was a huge increase in the numbers of reported racist incidents and so on and so forth. And I think racism, we've come full circle. So I remember my parents telling me the racism they experienced, but I think we've come full circle. So I argue in my work that these aren't new racisms. These are just old racisms. And I've got some quotes. I don't know if you're happy for me to read them out or not. Okay, let me just find them, just to sort of really demonstrate that point around the fact of this isn't new, but these are just old racisms. And in fact, it's the policy making itself is white. It's what I argue, it's white policy making, and the people that benefit from it are whites. So in 2000, Bonilla Silva and Foreman argued a new race talk has emerged in the reproduction of white supremacy. It allows whites to appear not racist, to preserve their privileged status, to blame blacks for their lower status, and criticise any institutional approach, such as, for example, affirmative action, or indeed the Race Equality Charter, that attempts to ameliorate racial inequality. Now, that quote was in 2000. That was 21 years ago. And in 2011, myself and Martin Myers carried out a piece of work looking at rural racism. What happened when black and minority ethnic parents complained about racism in predominantly white areas? And this was 2011. This was 10 years ago. And we said to argue that post-Macpherson has resulted in a post-racial society, we argue is utterly absurd. Such discourses serve only to further disadvantage and marginalise Black and minority ethnic communities. We argue that racism exists at every level of society. It permeates our schools, our colleges, and indeed our universities. It is alive in all elements of society, our popular culture, our media, and the social spaces that we occupy. And in 2018, in my book, White Privilege, I argued higher education institutions are spaces of white privilege. They fail to cater for the experiences of Black and minority ethnic groups. They employ a rhetoric of inclusion, but one that is rarely evidenced in practice or outcomes. So I put it to you that these aren't new racisms, these are just old racisms. It's business as usual.
Thank you, Kalwant. And I also was wondering whether perhaps when you were in the progress of writing White Privilege, I'm presuming that you had to have very sort of frank and honest conversations with people that you were working with, I'm sure, in the education sector. And I wondered whether writing that book, you felt like there were any sort of solutions or any sort of approaches in really sort of actively dismantling the structures of institutional racism.
Yeah, I did have some quite uncomfortable, actually, difficult conversations about confronting white privilege, because this is something that people feel very, very uncomfortable about. You know, if you think it's difficult for people to talk about racism, it's even more difficult, 10 times more, to talk about white privilege. So some of the solutions and ways forward that I've suggested in the book, and that I've also discussed with colleagues and vice chancellors, etc., I think that we have to be really quite bold in making a difference, because we kind of keep, I mean, like I said, you know, I've been in this game long enough. We keep going round and round and round, you know, and we don't really see any difference. So first of all, I think that universities should think about having a target system. We can't have quota systems in this country because they are illegal. I know that quota systems exist in other countries, but we don't have them here. But each university should have a target system for the number of Black and minority ethnic professors in senior decision-making roles. So currently, there are only 100 Black professors, of which 30 are women. Now, the group that is the most significantly disadvantaged in higher education, staff and students, are Black groups. So we know that the category BME is problematic, but we must recognise there are differences within and between those BME groups. So you see Indian groups doing very well, Chinese groups doing well, but it's the Black groups and Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups that are the most disadvantaged. We also need targets for the numbers of Black and minority ethnic British students attending elite Russell Group universities. So you only have to look at Oxbridge, and you have to look at the elite Russell Group universities, and the numbers of British BME students attending is very low. Okay, and we know that there are reasons for these, particularly around racism and so on and so forth. That's why there's a huge BME attainment gap in all of the universities, particularly actually interesting to see the ones in elite Russell Group universities. So I think we need to break down these barriers by having a target system, because universities often respond to their call around equity, inclusion and social justice by giving numbers of internationalisation and international students. That's not what I'm interested in. It's very easy to recruit international students of colour because they're paying twice the fees. And in this neoliberal climate that we live in, and the marketisation of higher education, universities are only concerned with money, which takes me on to my next point, where I argue the Race Equality Charter mark must be linked to funding. So any institution that is not signed up to the Race Equality Charter mark should not be allowed to apply for funding. Now, excuse me, when it was announced that the Athena Swan Charter would be linked to biomedical funding, the NIHR introduced that back in 2008, I think. Within 1 week, the number of institutions that signed up to the Athena Swan Charter increased by 400%. So money doesn't talk, money screams. And the third thing I think that universities should think about is every time I give a presentation on race, I'm always asked the question, it's the what about us question. What about gender? Okay, I'm always asked, what about gender? What about class? Okay, gender has always been given precedence over race in higher education. White women, middle class women and working class women have benefited considerably from policy making in higher education at the expense of BME women and BME men. So let's not think about this hierarchy of oppression and let race become a primary focus rather than always taking a secondary focus. Of course, I'm not saying that intersectionality here isn't important, but I'm always told, oh, what about white working class women? They suffer X, Y, and Z. Yes, of course, white working class women suffer these disadvantages, as do working class women of colour. But working class women of colour also experience racism that white women, working class women, do not experience. So white working class women and men benefit from their white privilege, whether they like it or not. And they are complicit in upholding the white supremacy and white racial social order which exists in higher education. So I really think we need to be bold here. And the last thing I think that's really important, actually, is that universities must acknowledge racism and white privilege, because a failure to acknowledge results in a failure to act.
Thanks, Kalwant. I think that diverts us into a really good question that I had. And what do you think can be done to sort of combat the sense of indifference, or people sort of call it fake wokeness, that is encountered when these issues are raised with, you know, educational institutions, and also I guess arts and culture spaces. And I do remember after the eruption of the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw a lot of universities and institutions sort of trying to sort of say that, oh, you know, we support this, but at times it felt like it wasn't enough. It felt like they were, you know, these institutions were really doing the bare minimum. And I think, you know, when that happens, you know, of course, those students are going to be in uproar about that, because, you know, you'd like to think that, you know, going to a university, you know, to do a degree, you think that you're going to learn more and you're going to become a better person. And you'd like to think that the institution would reflect that. And then necessarily it doesn't. You know, it still upholds still has all these underpinnings of colonialism and imperialism. And, you know, I think it's really disappointing when, you know, these institutions sort of promote that fake wokeness in institutions. And I was wondering what really can be done to combat that. And do you think that in order to progress, is it the higher members of staff in the institutions, or what is it that sort of really can combat the indifference?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you've asked me that, because and I'm writing about this at the moment, so watch this space. So what I found was particularly interesting after the eruption of the Black Lives Matter. Suddenly everybody was an anti-racist. Suddenly everybody felt that race was important. Suddenly everybody felt that they had to be an anti-racist. Now, during the time we were conducting some research with secondary school students aged between 16 and 18, and we conducted interviews, and those same students who felt that it was okay to use the N-word with their friends were putting Black Lives Matter on their Instagram stories. Okay, so, you know, come on, let's really talk about what this is about. So that's the first thing. The second thing, as you quite rightly articulated, and I've kept a note of this because, as I said, I'm writing about it, is that all universities on their Twitter handles said that we do not accept, we have a zero tolerance approach to anti-racism. These were the same universities who do not have one BME professor. These were the same universities who have a BME attainment gap that is bigger than the national average. These are the same universities who allow racism to take place in their institution. And only 3 months ago, we had a black student at Manchester University who was racially profiled for looking like a drug dealer by the security staff, and the university did nothing about it. So come on, let's wake up and smell the coffee. Okay, this was just a bandwagonist term, and these are just people who are woke because it suits them and because it's trendy. Okay, this window dressing must result in real significant action and change. And to answer your question, it's everybody's responsibility, Amrit. It's not the responsibility of the Vice-Chancellor or the Pro-Vice-Chancellor. It's the responsibility of all members of staff. The student voice is hugely important here, and it's also a responsibility for every individual to check their own white privilege and to think about their privilege and how they are complicit in maintaining that notion of white supremacy which exists in higher education. So I think it's really interesting that what happens, and this is what I talk about in the book, it's only when white groups feel that their white privilege is threatened that it makes them want to behave differently. And if you look at that from a critical race theory perspective, which is how I look at my work, so policy making around for instance, the Race Equality Charter, although I do agree it's a really good way forward, and I've said that everybody should sign up to it, we must be really careful the way in which we look at it, because Derek Bell argues that universities, institutions will only sign up to equity policy making because it benefits them more. OK, so you could argue that the university will sign up to the Race Equality Charter because they want to sell themselves as inclusive and diverse and fair, but yet they won't make any real changes. So it's tokenistic. And equally, universities will have a charter mark and they can sell it to parents and students, so they will come to that university and pay the fees of £9,250. So if universities are going to invest in these things, it has to result in real outcomes and real significant change. And the other thing that I think is really important is that, I was going to say white groups, but I think we all have, but mainly white groups. White groups have a significant role to play in anti-racist work, particularly as allies, okay, because they're already in a privileged position, regardless of anything that they do. They're always in that privileged position because they are by worthy of their whiteness. So they have those privileges afforded to white privilege, okay, which you or I do not have. But if they see racism taking place and they do nothing about it, they are complicit in that racism. So what I'm saying is everybody needs to speak up. So it's all well and good us putting on our Twitter handles, we are anti-racist, we don't believe in racism. What are you doing about it? The next time you see a student, a BME student or a BME member of staff experiencing microaggressions, and you don't stand up for that person and use your white privilege, you are complicit in maintaining the white racial social order.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really true, what you said, Kalwant, about people remaining complicit. It's so easy to sort of turn a blind eye, you know, especially when it makes you uncomfortable. And I think a lot of people, especially white people, are uncomfortable about having these conversations, but it's also about confronting that uncomfortability in order to make a step forward, right? You know, that's the first thing that needs to be done. And going back to what we said about institutions, you know, quite often, you know, when they're promoting themselves, you know, for UCAS applications, you know, a lot of these universities are saying, yeah, we're a diverse university, we have a zero tolerance for discrimination of all kinds, you know. And I wondered perhaps what you think, what sort of are the differences between, you know, the terms diversity and equality, and how do these words sort of present themselves in these educational systems? Because I think they are sort of used as these buzzwords nowadays, and it definitely feels like, it sort of feels like these words are synonymous to social justice, but in reality, it never quite matches up to the actions that they claim to make.
Yeah, so we have this notion, don't we, Amrit, that universities are progressive, forward-thinking, liberal, have social justice at the heart of their agenda. And you've already alluded, well, you haven't alluded to it, you've said it, and I've said it, that is not the case. You know, universities are white spaces reserved for the privileged white few, actually, particularly elite universities. And I think what's really interesting here is the way that they approach equality, diversity and inclusion is really interesting. And those are buzzwords, okay? You know, they mean one thing to one person and one university, and they mean something else to another university. And I'm not even going to attempt to define them because, you know, there are books on that. But what's really interesting in what I call this discourse, I call it a discourse of denial, which exists in higher education, which results in this hierarchy of oppression. So under the umbrella of EDI, universities can give the impression, the window dressing impression, that they are in fact addressing inequalities in higher education under this umbrella. So they can say, okay, yeah, we're going to invest in the Race Equality Charter, we've got the Athena Swan Charter, LGBTQ, we're a member of Stonewall, and so on and so forth. But what you find, and this is something that I've actually got evidence on in terms of analysing university policy documents, is that within those documents and within the practice that comes from those documents, it's all about gender. It's all about everything other than race. So they give the impression of dealing with race under these buzzwords, as you've already said, equality, diversity, inclusion, whatever that means. But really what happens, it's that what about usness again. So race is always taken a secondary priority. And then on top of that, if they are questioned about that, they say, well, actually, we're doing intersectionality, when they don't really understand what intersectionality is. Because again, intersectionality has become a bit of a buzzword, hasn't it? Everybody uses it, but nobody ever understands what it means, or they don't actually use it correctly. So I think the problem is here, and when I conducted a piece of work comparing the Race Equality Charter with the Athena Swan Charter, my researcher is a white woman, and she conducted most of the interviews, and it was fascinating the responses that she got that I would not have got because I'm a woman of colour. So many of the respondents said to her, oh, we don't need a race equality charter. Why should we have a race equality charter? Because there are more women than there are BME people in our university. There's 51% of women. We don't need to address race. So that was the first thing. The second thing was the geographical argument, whereby some universities said, well, actually, we're a predominantly white institution. We're a white area. We don't need to look at race, which entirely misses the point, actually. It beggars belief that that is a response that we got from senior managers. And the third response was, well, actually, we haven't got the funding. We've got the funding for gender, but we haven't really got to invest in the Athena Swan Charter, but we haven't really got the funding to invest in the Race Equality Charter. So I think that excuse after excuse comes up because individuals, universities don't want to confront their own role in the upholding of white supremacy. But also something else I wanted to add, which I think you mentioned in your first question, is I think it's really, really important for universities to think about their own role in imperialism and colonialism and slavery and where they got their money from and why they are where they are today. And I think universities really have not even begun to think about those issues.
Yeah, I had a conversation, or I've been having many conversations, obviously a part of a particular reality, and I sort of had a thought the other day that there's this thing of like departments within universities, they should bear the responsibility of undoing dated and exclusionary knowledge, with white supremacist and imperialistic underpinnings. And because we have this sort of legacy of exclusionary knowledge and learning, I'm sure there's so many scholars and academics and educators that have probably spent most of their career with no knowledge of non-Western sort of intellectual contributions. And it got me thinking, it's quite a big question, but is it time for institutions to send their faculties, back to school? Yeah.
That's a great question. Yeah, absolutely it is. And I think that, I think that we as a collective, okay, especially students, because students have got more voice than us, I think it's about time that we dismantled the racist, sexist, classist, patriarchal higher education systems that we are all employed in, because that is actually what they are. And I think that we have to stand up to these particular issues whenever we can, whether it's through what you're doing today, questioning these issues, which I think is fantastic, or whether it's through looking at curriculums, how we are. I mean, I really don't like the term decolonizing the curriculum, but I will use that term just for ease today, because again, that's another 2-hour discussion, I think. Whether it's decolonizing the curriculum, whether it's understanding how we are teaching, what we are teaching, who we are employing, whether we are practicing what we preach. So I think that there are things that we can do, but I'll go back to what I said before. This has to be done as a collective. So it's not my responsibility to do it because I'm a one individual person. I am in a position of power and I accept that, and I should use that responsibly by disseminating my research the way that I do. But equally, I think it's bigger than all of us. So it's everybody's responsibility to do that. But I don't think the will is there, because white privilege will be threatened, and white groups do not want that white privilege threatened. They want to hold on to everything that means for them. So I think we do have a long way to go, but student voice is hugely important. And I think the students mobilizing is absolutely fantastic, because whilst there is a tension there for students, I think that they have a lot of power. Why do they have power? Because they pay fees of £9,250 a year, and they are the ones that will be listened to. So I think that, you know, it has to be something that's big. Now, I am going to say something that's probably a bit negative, but I feel as though since Black Lives Matter, that was a moment, and I don't really think that anything's changed. I think I've been here before where we've had political significant moments, and I think that, in fact, it's business as usual. Let's move on. You know, in fact, it's got worse, I think. I actually think if you look at the statistics around it's no accident that black students are less likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first. It's no accident that black students are more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate. It's no accident that black students are more likely to experience racism and drop out of university. It's no accident that black young men are more likely to be stopped and searched. It's no accident that black men are more likely to go to prison. None of this is accidental. This is all intentional. It's due to institutional, structural and individual racism.
It is interesting how, you know, there was sort of a big momentum, and, you know, I think a lot of schools, a lot of institutions, a lot of workplaces really sort of, you know, came out and said, you know, owning up to their, you know, being accountable and saying, you know, we will step up, and, you know, proposing all these sort of claims that we'll do better. We're going to introduce more workshops and to promote anti-racism. And, you know, like you said, that you feel like it's died down. What do you think it takes? Like what, and obviously we all have to work as a collective, you know, that's the most important step, but what do you think? I mean, obviously it's going to be a slow progress, but what is it that we can do? What are those small little like actions that we can take all together to sort of really sort of dismantle the structures? And obviously that's quite hard because these institutions have been around for such a long time, and of course they uphold all these colonialist underpinnings, like we said. But is there sort of any solutions, any small solutions that staff and students can do together?
I think that the things that we can do together is to keep talking about it and not to be silenced. It's hugely important to continue to have a voice and to continue to have a space for that voice, not just in these comfortable spaces that we're in today, which is great, because I hope we're all singing from the same hymn sheet here, but also in those uncomfortable spaces where white senior managers are making decisions, that we need to continue to have a voice there. But it has to be through the university, and I've said this already, employing more BME individuals in senior decision-making roles, having a seat at the table, which makes a difference. Now, I say that kind of being a bit wary, and Derek Bell calls it the rules of racial standing, you know, something that a person of colour says is not ever seen in the same way as a white person will say it. So, for instance, Kim Badenoch is black. She is a woman of colour, and she said that all those things she said in the House of Commons. Tony Sewell chaired the racial disparities report, and he is a man of colour, and all the members were also people of colour, and they found no evidence of institutional racism. So I hesitate to say what I've just said, where these are the rules of racial standing that Derek Bell talks about. You know, who better than to have a black man or a black woman stand up and say there's no such thing as institutional racism? Who better than to say that, right? So I think that we have to continue to, and we have to fight against the far right rhetoric and narrative that's coming from our government in all sorts of ways. And I think that we can only do that as a collective. And we see that, as I've already said, in the reports that are being published, and in the ways in which race has now, white people are now the victims of race. It's not people of colour anymore. It's white working class people who are the victims of racism and racial discourse, because we as black people and BME people, people of colour, you know, we're doing really well, and there's no such thing as institutional racism. So that's a really difficult premise to move on from, isn't it? And I think that's propaganda. This is propaganda that has been released by this government to peddle a particular narrative. And there is a forgottenness of the fact that people of colour are also working class, are also poor, and so on and so forth. So I think we have to be really careful, but we should not be silenced by that rhetoric. I would just like to really, first of all, to say thank you, especially to Amrit, for inviting me. And I just want to really finish, if I may, with a couple of quotes. Is that okay?
It's great. Yeah,
okay,
go ahead.
Brilliant. So, first of all, Derek Bell argues that whites will advance the cause of racial justice only when doing so coincides with their own self-interests. And Gloria Ladson-Billings argues whites are the main beneficiaries of educational policy making, even though they are designed to serve the marginalised. For example, white women have been the main beneficiaries of affirmative action in the US, just like white middle-class women have been the main beneficiaries of the Athena Swan Charter in the UK. And I argue, as long as white identity and white privilege are not threatened, white groups are supportive of diversity and inclusion programmes, such as the ones we've spoken about today, particularly around the Race Equality Charter. Consequently, I argue, they can sell themselves as diverse and fair, as long as their white privilege remains intact and unthreatened. And I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kalwant. That was really insightful and just really valuable. Thank you for speaking today. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Amrit, for inviting me, and I hope the rest of the day goes well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.